So you want to own a sawmill. Logs come in. Boards go out. Every house in America is made of the thing you sell, and the trees grow back whether you show up or not. Oldest manufacturing business on the continent. And it looks like the simplest. Sounds simple. It isn't. Logs have to come from somewhere close, and somebody else decides whether you can cut them. Boards sell at a price set on a future screen 1,000 miles away. And roughly half of what comes off your saw is not a board at all. Chips, sawdust, bark. If the neighbor who buys that waste closes down, your mill dies with him. What it costs to build one, where the money actually comes from, because it is not only lumber. Why a perfectly good mill in a region full of trees shut down for having nowhere to send its sawdust. Why a man in 1900 worked out that the mill was never the asset. The buy-in. Start with a real number, because this industry has been building again. Big River Forest Products opened a new sawmill at Gloucester, Mississippi, in the first half of 2024. $200 million, built from bare ground up to 300 million board feet of dimensional lumber and timbers a year. Note what that mill eats. Upwards of 1 million tons of timber a year, sourced from the surrounding region. Hold on to that, because it is the whole risk in one line. You did not buy a factory. You bought a factory plus a permanent appetite for 1 million tons of a local crop. Second door. You buy existing mills, and they tend to move in blocks. Interfor acquired 4 sawmills from Georgia Pacific in Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and Oregon for $375 million in cash. One of them had already been shut by its previous owner, taking about 150 million board feet of production and 188 jobs with it. Read the shape of that. 4 mills, one already dead, for less than double what a single new one costs to build. A mature industry, consolidating. Third door. You upgrade what you already own, which is where most of the real money goes. Weyerhaeuser put $157 million into modernizing a single existing sawmill in Louisiana. Hood Industries announced a brownfield rebuild at Waynesboro, Mississippi at $260 million for an initial 300 million board feet a year, which the company said would raise its own capacity by 88%. And Weyerhaeuser broke ground on a $500 million engineered wood facility in South Arkansas, about 200 jobs, sourcing its fiber from timberland the company already owns. That last detail is not decoration. Remember it. So the tiers run roughly like this. A new large sawmill, $200 to $300 million. A modernization, $100 to $200 million. A package of tired mills at whatever the seller will take. Now the strange part, and it is the reason this episode exists. $500 million of new investment has been announced across Mississippi, Maine, Louisiana, Florida, and Oregon, adding roughly 2.5 billion board feet of capacity. And American softwood self-sufficiency has climbed towards 75%. Meanwhile, mills are closing everywhere. What you inherit a radius, and it is smaller than you think. A log is heavy, low in value per ton, and expensive to move. Haul it far enough, and freight eats the lumber. So every sawmill draws from a circle around itself, and inside that circle sits a finite quantity of standing timber. Somebody has to be willing to sell you. That circle is the wood basket, and you do not control what happens inside it. British Columbia is the clearest illustration anywhere. According to the province's own Forest Industry Council, access to economic fiber fell from 60 million cubic meters in 2018 to 35 million cubic meters of actual harvest in 2023. Not because the trees vanished. Beetle kill, wildfire, a reduced allowable cut, and a permitting system mills describe as taking years to produce a single cutting permit. Watch what that did. 21 lumber mills closed permanently or indefinitely in that province since 2023. Roughly 15,000 jobs gone from the sector since 2022. One operator reported over 47% of provincial industry capacity curtailed since 2018. Half the mills in a place famous for trees idled in under a decade. You also inherit a residual problem, which almost nobody outside the business understands. Saw a log, and you do not get a log's worth of boards. You get boards, plus chips, plus sawdust, plus shavings, plus bark. Depending on the log and the mill, roughly half the volume arriving at your gate leaves as something other than lumber. Those residuals have to go somewhere. Chips to pulp and paper mills, sawdust and shavings to pellet and panel plants, bark to fuel and landscaping. Every one of those outlets is a separate business, owned by somebody else, with its own economics and its own closure risk. You also inherit trade policy, which here is not background noise. It is weather. Combined anti-dumping and countervailing duties on Canadian softwood jumped from about 14.5% to roughly 35% in the summer of 2025. Then in October, a 10% tariff on imported timber and softwood lumber landed on top under a separate authority. Own an American mill, and that is a wall built around your market by other people. Own a Canadian one, and it is a permanent tax on every board you send south into a country that takes about a quarter of its softwood from you. Same trees, same saws, opposite consequences, decided in a hearing room. The revenue layers. Number 1, lumber, which is the obvious layer and the smaller half of the story than you would guess. A standard American single-family home uses roughly 15,000 board feet of framing lumber, plus more than 2,200 square feet of softwood plywood, and more than 6,800 of oriented strand board. Your product is priced off a weighted composite of key framing lumber items, quoted in dollars per thousand board feet. That composite closed around $464 in mid-November of 2025, and near $487 in early April of 2026. For reference, the 2019 average was about $380. The pandemic peak went past $1,500. Number 2, grade, which is where the skill lives. A log is not one product. Cut it well, and you pull high-grade boards at a premium. Cut it badly, and the same log yields economy grade at a discount. Modern mills scan every log in 3 dimensions and compute the highest value cutting pattern before the saw touches it, which is a large part of what $200 million buys. Same tree, different money, decided by software and a fraction of an inch. Number 3, the residuals, which are not a bonus. They are structural. Chips to the pulp mill, sawdust to the pellet plant, bark to the boiler, shavings to bedding and panel board. In a well-placed mill, these outlets take the half of the log that is not lumber and turn it into revenue instead of a disposal cost. Number 4, owning the dirt, the layer that outlasts everything else here. Timberland appreciates, grows its own inventory, and can be held through any lumber cycle. The largest players in this industry are structured as real estate trusts that happen to run sawmills, not the other way around. Now stop, because one closure notice explains more than any price chart. Listen to that again. In November of 2025, West Fraser announced it was permanently closing 2 sawmills. First, 100 Mile House in British Columbia. 165 employees, 160 million board feet of capacity. The stated reason was that the mill could no longer reliably access an adequate volume of economically viable timber. That one you can predict. No trees, no mill. Second, Augusta, Georgia. 130 employees, 140 million board feet. That mill sat in the American South in the middle of one of the most productive timber-growing regions on the planet, where nobody is short of pine. Here's the reason the company gave: challenging lumber demand and the loss of economically viable residual outlets, which combined had compromised the mill's long-term viability. Read that second phrase again. The loss of economically viable residual outlets. The mill had nowhere left to sell its chips and sawdust. Listen to that again. A sawmill surrounded by trees with functioning equipment and 130 trained people was shut down because the businesses that bought the half of the log which is not lumber had gone away. Those outlets vanished for a reason that runs in reverse. When Canfor announced it was closing a pulp mill near Prince George, a union official spelled out what happens next. Pulp mills are fed by sawmills. Close the pulp mill, and the sawmills lose the outlet for their chips. And jobs go at the sawmills too. So this industry is a web, not a chain. Every mill depends on neighbors it does not own. And when one node fails, the failure travels.
Now let's see what it costs to hold your place in that web.
The ledger. Start with the line that dominates every other line. Fibre.
Logs are the overwhelming majority of what a sawmill spends, and unlike almost every other input in this series, that price is set locally rather than globally. Stumpage, harvesting, and the truck ride to your gate all get decided inside your own wood basket by landowners and contractors who have other customers.
When a competing mill opens inside your circle, you do not lose a customer. You gain a bidder for your logs. That is why sawmill operators watch new mill announcements the way a refiner watches crude. Next, the capital and how fast it goes stale.
$200 million buys optical scanners, curve sawing gangs, automated sorters, and control systems, deciding the cutting pattern for every log in fractions of a second.
That is what lets a modern mill pull more lumber out of the same tree than a mill from 20 years ago. So, the old mill down the road is not only older, it is structurally less profitable on identical logs forever until somebody spends $150 million on it. Next, energy and drying. Green lumber has to be kiln dried before it ships, and kilns are large continuous consumers of heat. Most mills burn their own bark and sawdust to raise it, which is elegant right up until the moment you would rather have sold that material to somebody else. Next, labor and where these mills sit. A sawmill is almost always the largest employer in a small rural place. When West Fraser closed the mill at 100 Mile House, the direct loss was 165 jobs. The district mayor put the real figure closer to 500 once contractors, haulers, and local businesses were counted. That is the collision this industry keeps having with the towns it built. The mill is a line on a balance sheet in Vancouver or Seattle. It is the entire economy of a place with a few thousand people in it. Next, duties and tariffs if you are on the wrong side of a border. A Canadian producer shipping south has been paying combined duties around 35%, with a 10% tariff layered on from October of 2025. In April of 2026, the Commerce Department preliminarily proposed cutting the combined duty to about 24.8%. But the separate 10% tariff sits on top of any revision, which holds the effective burden close to 35% anyway. Preliminary numbers change nothing. Anybody actually pays until a final determination. So your cost of market access is a number under review by a foreign government that you learn about in a press release.
Add it up.
A heavy, fixed cost base, a dominant input priced inside a radius you cannot expand, a selling price set nationally, and a market access cost set politically. Which is the trap? The trap. A sawmill needs 3 separate things to be true at the same time, and it does not control any of them. 1. Economically viable timber inside your haul radius, which depends on landowners, permits, allowable cut, beetles, and fire. 2. A lumber price high enough to work, which depends on housing starts, mortgage rates, and trade policy. 3. Somebody nearby who wants the half of every log that is not lumber, which depends on pulp mills, pellet plants, and panel plants you do not own. Lose any one of those 3, and the mill closes. It does not matter that the other 2 are fine, which is exactly what the 2025 closures show, side by side, in one announcement from one company. 100 Mile House lost the timber. Augusta lost the residual outlet. Same owner, same month, same outcome, opposite causes. Now put the price swing on top of it. Lumber futures traded around $659 per thousand board feet on the 22nd of July, 2026, up more than 5% in a month, driven by more than 900 wildfires burning across Western Canada and by sawmill capacity that had contracted about 6% from a year earlier. Note what pushed that price up. Not demand. The price rose because the industry was losing production, which is the cruelest version of a pattern this series keeps finding. The best price environments arrive precisely when supply is being destroyed, so the mills celebrating a strong market are often standing next to the ones that just burned or closed. Meanwhile, the demand side offered nothing. Single-family housing starts fell about 7% in 2025 to 943,000 units, the weakest since the pandemic recovery. When starts jumped 19% in mid-2026, the increase came mostly from multifamily construction, which uses far less lumber per unit than a single-family house. So, the headline said housing was booming, and lumber demand barely moved. Here is the trap in one sentence. You own a machine that needs a forest, a housing market, and a neighbor, and you were never given a vote on any of them. Somebody worked this out in 1900, and he did it by buying the one thing that was not a machine. The history digression. Frederick Weyerhaeuser arrived from Germany in 1852, aged 18, and took a job at a sawmill in Illinois. When that business failed in the Panic of 1857, he bought it. Over the next 40 years, he built the largest lumbering enterprise in the country, working through the pine forests of Wisconsin and Minnesota. By the 1890s, he had a problem any mill owner in this video would recognize. The trees near his mills were running out, so he moved to St. Paul, Minnesota, where he happened to live next door to a railroad man named James J. Hill. By 1900, Hill had taken control of the Northern Pacific Railroad, which had been handed something like 44 million acres of federal land in the 1870s and 80s as payment for building a transcontinental line. A great deal of it was covered in trees. One evening, the conversation between the two neighbors turned to timberland in Washington state. Weyerhaeuser needed trees. Hill needed cash. The story goes that Weyerhaeuser opened at $5 an acre for 900,000 acres. Hill asked $7. They settled at $6. On the 3rd of January 1900, the papers were signed. 900,000 acres, $5,400,000, $3 million down, and 8 semi-annual payments of $300,000 plus interest. The down payment strained his finances to the limit, one of the largest single private land transfers in American history. And as part of the deal, Hill gave him extremely low rates for shipping timber east on his own trains. Nobody knew how much timber was actually on that land. Plenty of people thought the purchase was wildly speculative. 2 weeks later, he incorporated the Weyerhaeuser Timber Company. By 1903, he owned more than 1.5 million acres in Washington. Across his lifetime, the company bought close to 2 million acres at an average of $8.80 an acre. He became, by one account, the 8th richest man in America. Here is the part that matters for your ledger. He did not build a sawmill in Washington until 1903, 3 years after the purchase, and even then, the company gave comparatively little attention to the manufacturing side. Understand what he bought. Not a lumber company, a land position with a shipping contract attached. Every survivor in this industry is running a version of that trade. A mill is a machine that wears out and gets outcompeted by a newer machine. The forest grows back. The death spiral case. Now walk the arc that has been running in slow motion across an entire province. British Columbia has been the most productive softwood lumber region in North America for a century. Trees grow back. Ports are there. The mills were world-class. First, blow. Fibre. Mountain pine beetle killed vast areas of interior forest. Wildfire took more. The allowable cut came down. A permitting system executives describe as taking years to issue a cutting permit slowed access to what remained. The province's own Forest Industry Council put the collapse in one pair of numbers: 60 million cubic meters of economic fiber available in 2018, 35 million cubic meters actually harvested in 2023. Second blow. Trade. Combined duties on Canadian softwood entering the United States roughly doubled to about 35% in 2025, and a further 10% tariff arrived that October. The largest customer for that lumber sits across a border with a tax gate on it. Third blow. Demand. American single-family starts fell to their weakest level since the pandemic recovery. Now watch the machine come apart. Over 47% of the province's industry capacity curtailed since 2018. 21 lumber mills closed permanently or indefinitely since 2023. Roughly 15,000 jobs gone from the sector since 2022. Then, the second-order effects start. Canfor announced the closure of a pulp mill near Prince George, a city of about 67,000 people, taking 300 more jobs. That pulp mill was a customer for Sawmill chips. Closing it removes a residual outlet from every sawmill feeding it, pushing those mills toward the Augusta problem. A union official described the cascade plainly. Pulp mills are fed by sawmills, so jobs go at the sawmills too. Then the contractors attached to those facilities. Then ask, who hauls logs to a pulp mill when there is no pulp mill anywhere nearby? At 100 Mile House, the mayor put it in terms that matter to a town. Lose those good-paying jobs and it affects everything. Retail stores rely on the Christmas trading period to carry them through January, February, and March, and they were not going to have that cushion.
That is the collision this business keeps having.
The closure is rational. The arithmetic is correct. And the town does not get a vote either. The survivors' habit 1. Own the trees. Weyerhaeuser's 1900 insight. Still working. Companies that ride out these cycles hold timberland, which appreciates, grows its own inventory, and does not care what a mill is worth this quarter. If your fiber comes off your own ground, a competitor opening inside your radius is an inconvenience instead of an emergency. Habit 2. Be in the wood basket that still has wood. Compare the two closures again. The British Columbia Mill died for lack of timber. Southern American mills are the ones attracting $200 and $300 million investments, because in the American South, the trees are actually there. Geography here is not a preference.
It is the primary asset.
Habit 3. Buy the residual outlet, or build near one that will survive. Augusta is the lesson. If half your output depends on a neighbor's business model, that neighbor is part of your risk, whether you like it or not. The strongest operators integrate downstream into pellets, panels, and engineered wood, so the chip pile has somewhere to go that they control. Habit 4. Modernize or die on schedule. Optical scanning and optimized cutting are not luxury features. They change how much sellable lumber comes out of an identical log. An unmodernized mill loses money on the same tree its neighbor profits from, and that gap only widens. Habit 5. Treat trade policy as a line item. Duties on Canadian softwood have been contested continuously since 1982, and rates get reviewed every year. Any operator whose plan assumes a stable number across that border has misunderstood the industry. The verdict. Does this actually work? Run the years on a model mill shaped like the Gloucester plant.
$200 million of capital, 300 million board feet a year, eating about 1 million tons of timber.
Lumber is priced per 1,000 board feet, so 300 million board feet is 300,000 units of the thing that carries the price. Good year. Sell into a market like the futures price in July of 2026, around $659 per 1,000 board feet. Roughly $198 million of lumber revenue in a year. Softer year. Take the composite in early 2026, about $487. Same mill, same crew, same logs, roughly $146 million. $52 million. Gone on identical output. Bad year. Take the 2019 average, about $380. Now the same 300 million board feet is worth about $114 million. Understand what those numbers are and are not. Revenue, not margin. Out of every one comes the log bill, which is the dominant cost here, plus energy, labor, maintenance, and depreciation on $200 million of plant. The swing between a good year and a bad one is $84 million of revenue on a mill that cost $200 million to build. That tells you how fast the return on this asset moves without anything happening inside the fence. Then, the version that ends the story. Lumber price is fine. Mill runs well. Then, the pulp mill 40 miles away announces a closure, and half of what comes off your saw has nowhere to go. Or the province cuts the allowable harvest, and the logs stop arriving at a price that works. No cost cut fixes either, because neither happened inside your business. That is the trade. A machine turning a local crop into a national commodity, with half its output depending on a neighbor. In a town that has nothing else. You never bought a sawmill. You bought a place in somebody else's forest, and the forest was never yours to keep.